For this mock exercise, we're going to take a look at period cost allocation. And we're going to use Phoenix Partners to highlight how do we allocate support departments within a particular organization. So let's say there's an IT department, an HR department, and perhaps an operations department, and they have certain overhead costs or support costs. And the question is, how do we allocate those period costs to the individual products or individual departments that we may want to be able to track certain cost or certain profitability measurement for that particular department. So we're going to take a look at, basically in this question, we're going to look at direct and step-down method. So before we go to the actual question, let's take a look at the methods that we have available. So there are basically three methods, and they are called direct, step-down, and reciprocal. The first one is direct, and basically direct method allocates the support cost to the production department directly. And essentially it ignores the fact that support costs may actually have costs associated with supporting other support departments. So we're going to assume under the direct method that no interaction between support departments occurs prior to the actual allocation. So in this example, we have the IT department and the accounting department, and you'll see that accounting department supports the IT and IT supports the accounting department. And you can see that under the direct method, we completely ignore the fact that these two departments have cost allocations to each other. And of course, we directly ignore that and we just allocate the cost directly to the production department. The second method is called the step-down method. And this method essentially allocates, recognizes that certain support department does support each other, and therefore a cost associated with that support should be allocated to that support department. But in this case, a step down means we're going to actually use a predetermined or a certain ranking order in which we will decide which department supports or allocates to another support department. So in this example, you'll see that this one-way allocation between the two support departments is the IT supports the accounting, and of course the accounting, although they support the IT, we're going to ignore that allocation. So it's called a step down. We essentially predetermine the order in which the support department is allocated to another support department. So in this case, we rank that the IT department will allocate directly to the accounting department. And one of the questions in the videos, we're going to see how do we determine how to rank the support department. How do we determine which of these support departments should charge other support department and which one should not. And in either cases, once that support department, so the accounting, once we accumulate their cost plus the allocation from the IT department, then we're going to allocate to the individual production department. So that's called a step down. The third method is called the reciprocal method. And here we're going to actually recognize the mutual services provided amongst all support departments. So we're going to figure out a way, and we're going to use a formula to determine how much of the allocation of cost to the accounting department is allocated to the IT department, and then vice versa. And this two-way interaction has to be allocated first to determine the full cost of accounting, the full cost of support before it gets allocated to the production department. So that's essentially your three methods of cost allocation or period cost allocation. So let's take a look at the question. So this question is it's called Phoenix. So why don't we read it together? And this question essentially starts with a company, and what do? They provide management consulting services to government and corporate clients. So these are the two departments, operating departments, in which they actually provide support. Phoenix has two support departments, the admin services and the info services. Let's call it the AS and the IS. And two operating divisions, the government and the corporate consulting of the Phoenix operations. This is what's going on in the first quarter of 2013. We can see that individual department has overhead cost. So here it's budgeted, okay, it's $600,000, and you've got $2.4 million in the IS department, the info department, and this is $600,000 in the admin department. And these are the individual operating costs of the government and the corporate consulting division. Now, our job will be to allocate these two costs to these two operating departments to determine the actual costs associated with operating these two departments. So these are the target departments that we're trying to determine the cost. Now, we're told that the support work supplied by AS is going to be based on headcount. So you'll see that the administration department uses headcount to allocate their cost, and how many headcounts, obviously they don't allocate to themselves, but we're going to look at the fact that 25% the headcount belongs to the IS department, 40% to the government, and 35% to the corporate. Then the next one, it says support work supplied by IS, and these are based on computer time. And you'll see that the info services provides 10% support to the accounting department, and then to the 30% to the government, and 60% to the corporate clients. Let's take a look at the required. It says allocate the two support departments, that is the admin and the IS department, to the two operating department, government and corporate, using the following methods. So direct, and now we've got two different step down. We're going to assume that the account administrative services is allocated first, and in part C, we're going to take a look at it. Again, the same step down analysis, except this time we're going to use info services as the first based allocation. Then part 2 says, let's compare the results and explain the difference in the support division costs allocated to each operating division. Then part 3 says, what approach might we use to decide the sequence in which to allocate the support costs when using the step-down approach. In other words, which one of these, B or C, should we actually recommend? Which one do you think we should do? Okay, so let's solve this problem. So in item number 1, I like to use a chart actually, and the chart was similar to the chart that was given to us. So let me write down the support department AS and IS first. That's the support department, and then the operating departments are government and corporate. Now, when we're dealing with direct method, we're going to ignore the cost associated with the support work for within each other in the support department. So we're going to ignore that completely. And we're just going to allocate, so for example, the $600,000, that's the costs associated with running the administrative services. We're going to allocate it based on the amount of consumption of services that each of these operating division consumes from the administrative services. So in this case, we're going to allocate using 40 divided by 75, because we've got 40 and 35 here. We're going to ignore this 25. So 40 and 35 is 75. And we're also going to allocate 35 over 75 for the corporate clients. So in this case, we're going to take 600,000 and we're going to allocate 600 times 40 divided by 75, gives us 320. And this is 280. Now similarly, we're going to allocate, so this is allocating now we're going to allocate the IS department. And again, we're going to take a look at what percentage. So in the IS, work supplied by IS, it's going to be 30% out of 60 plus 30 is 90. And of course, for corporate, it'll be 60 out of 90. So we're going to take 60, 30 out of 90, times 2.4 million, and 60 out of 90 times 2.4 million. And that would be 800,000 and 1.6 million. So altogether, this will be 0 because we have no cost left. And for government, it would be 1,120,000, 1,880,000. Now, if you remember, our traditional cost allocation method would have been just to take these two, so $3 million, we would have divided by some random cost allocation basis. It could be headcount, it could be number of square footage that they occupy within the premises. It could be some random non-financial measurement or metric to allocate that $3 million. And that's what we've learned. But now we're going to use this methodology, these three methods, to perhaps make some sense out of how do we allocate such a large pool of support costs. And how do we do that to each of the operating department? But more importantly, what if the other support department supports each other? Do we charge each other? And how does that work? And that's exactly what we're trying to tackle with this question. Now, that's just direct. And direct is fairly easy. As you can see, it just ignores the allocation between the two. And essentially, we're just going to allocate based on the consumption of the consumption of support costs based on the operating departments, and there's only two here. Now, in part B, we're going to use a step down, but this time we're going to say that the priority is we're going to actually allocate the admin services first. Okay, so that's the rule. So the cost, so let's put that back here. Okay, so let's do that first. So we're going to allocate first the admin cost. And we know the admin costs, support by admin, 25% goes to the IT department, 40% goes to the government, and 35% goes to the corporate. So we're going to take 25% times 600,000. And that is 150. And 40% of 600,000, that goes to 240 here. And then 35% times 600,000 is 210,000 here. So this is to allocate this. Now, this then becomes 0. Now, we need to calculate what the total cost is. For this department, it's 2,550. Now, we're going to allocate the IS department based on just the remaining 2 operating departments' usage. We're going to ignore the administrative services. So in that case, we're going to allocate the 2550 times 30 over 90, or 60 over 90. So this times 30 over 90 is 1/3. That's 850. And the remaining goes to the corporate. And again, this will be 0. The total of these will be 1,090,000, 1,910. So if you compare the two, you could see that this is a lot less and this is a lot more than if we use a direct method. We're going to compare it because I know part 2 asks us to compare the 3 methods. Okay, so let me recap. In this part, you'll see that we assume that we're going to rank the AS department first. So we're going to use them. You can take that cost and allocate it based on the usage of not only the operating department, but any support department that uses the administrative support. So in this case, we were given that, and we were told that 25% of this particular department is being consumed or supported by the IS department, and then you've got 40% for the government and 35% for corporate. And that's what we've done here. Then you add the fully loaded cost of the IS department, which is 2550. We're going to allocate to the remaining operating division. Now, if there were 3 support departments, for example, again, you would rank them to see which one gets allocated first. So you would do exactly what we just did here. But if there was a 3rd one, and assuming the IS department was the second ranked allocated cost, and the 3rd one would be HR department, let's say, then we would take the 2550 and we would allocate it to not only the HR plus the 2 operating department. Okay, now let's do the 3rd one. The 3rd one says let's do a step down, and in this case we're going to use the IS department first to allocate costs. So let's relabel the chart again. So for C, we're going to step down, IS first. So let's itemize all the total cost. Okay, so IS first means we're going to allocate this one first. And remember, how much of the administrative department support work is supported to the administrative department from the IS department is 10%. So we're going to allocate 10% of the 2.4 million to the AS department before we allocate the AS department. And of course, you have to allocate the rest of it. So in this case, we're going to take the first allocation, and we're going to use the 10%, 30%, and 60% times 2.4 million. What do we have? We're going to allocate this completely out, making this to go to 0. We're going to allocate 10% of that, which is 240, 30% to the government, and 1,400,000 to corporate. Now we need to add the AS, and the AS is 840,000. Then we're going to allocate the AS next. And this time we're only going to allocate it to the remaining 2 operating division. And the 2 operating division is going to be 60 and 45. So 40, sorry, and 35, which is 40 divided by 75. Okay? Or 35 over 75 times 840. So we're going to take 840 and we're going to allocate to these 2. So altogether, you'll see that the total cost is 1,168,000, 1,832,000. So let's do let's answer number 2. Number 2, if you remember, it says compare and explain the difference. Compare and explain the difference. So let's do a comparison. So this is government, corporate. Under the direct method, in Part A, the cost allocation in Part A was 1,120,000 and 1,880,000. Let me just highlight this. Make sure that we know that that is for a different method. And this is step down. AS first, 1,090,000. Step down, IS first, 1,168,000 and 1,832,000. So the direct method in Part A ignores support to other department. The step down partially recognizes the support to other support departments. So in this case, we saw that we recognize that the IS department does support the administrative department in Part C, and that's why we allocate certain of those costs. Now, the AS support group, so if you look at how much is the support group, you'll see that if I add these 2, this will be 3,600,000 over 3 million is approximately about 20%. Is that right? Let me just check. Yeah, it's 20%. So 6 million. Sorry, let me see. Yeah, 20% of the actual service provided. Okay, so if you look at it from that perspective, you see it kind of makes sense to have the IS allocated first because they're the biggest chunk, right? They're the biggest cost of the support department. So they are 80% of the entire cost department. So to me, it would make sense if we first assign the IS department, just a matter of size, relative to the other support department, to the administrative department first. And then, as a whole, we're going to allocate the fully loaded administrative department with the IS department charge in there to this 2 operating department. So to me, this one here is more reflective of the cost of running the 2 operating department, as opposed to, let's say, allocation of the admin department first. You'll see that the cost is slightly less for government, but more for corporate. But you can tell that the difference really between these 2 step down is not material, isn't it? It's not a lot. It's not that significant. Whereas the difference, perhaps, may lie on the direct method if you compare to, let's say, the step down for the AS first. Okay? So essentially, that is what, if I can explain it and answer the question, it's asking us compare and explain the difference. Well, you could see that, to me, that would make more sense, right? Now, for part 3, what is it asking us to do? It's asking us to, it says, what approach might be used to decide on a sequence? So in other words, what approach would we decide? Now, we've already kind of talked about the ranking, right? So there are 3 criteria that you could use. The first one, we saw the total dollar, so which is what I just did, right? We know that the admin is 600,000, and that's 20%, 80%. IS info is 2.4. So that's one way of analyzing. The other way is ranking the percentage. So what does that mean? So we're going to, the second one is we're going to allocate based on the ranking of percentage of their total services. So if I go back to the question, you can see that the admin services supplies work 25% to the info services, whereas the IS department only supplies 10%. So the AS department is 25% and the IS department 10%. Now, the other method is to perhaps allocate the support. In other words, we're going to rank based on total dollars of services provided. So we know that AS provides 25%. Right? So we know that AS provides 25% to IS, and 25% of 600,000 is 150. IS provides 10%, and 10% of 2.4 million is 240. So you've got basically 3 criteria. You've got the first one is total dollars. Okay, which one makes sense? This one is total dollars. This one is based on total dollar of services provided. This is the magnitude size of that particular support department. That's the first one. So this is the size of the support department. So let me write that down. Based on size of support department. That's the first one. The second one is based on percentage of their services provided to support department. And the third one is based on the total dollars of services provided. Now, the approach, okay, in B, so conclusion, B, better approximate the use, and we haven't seen it yet, but it better approximate the use of the reciprocal method. We haven't seen that third method yet. Remember, we said that there were going to be three methods. There's the direct, the step down. The reciprocal basically says we acknowledge that both support departments support each other, the AAS and the IS support each other, so we need to be able to come up with a formula that allocates the cost related to each of the support department so that we can really figure out what the fully loaded cost is per support department. So B gets us there a little bit closer, isn't it? And it says the higher the percentage support department provides to the other support department being incorporated to the step-down process than does the A and C. So B is a much better approach. Okay, thank you.